All right, Chapter 2 is called Methods of Research. With this chapter, we are going to be discussing all the different methodologies of collecting sociological research. And of course, there's more than one, because if there was only one, then everything would work out really great. But there's always some disadvantages and advantages of each of the methods. All right, we're going to first talk about Emil Durkheim. And he was a sociologist that thought, why can't we apply the scientific method to behaviors and help solve some of society's issues or problems? So knowing what the scientific method is, it's clearly used in sciences. That's why it's called a scientific method. But remember, sociology, the suffix of ology means that it is a study or science. And this is an approach that uses an objective opinion, an orderly procedure, so that you can come to an accurate conclusion. And so with that, it doesn't involve any personal opinions, it's not randomness, it's very precise science. And again, it's used in all sciences. Primary research is using research or facts that were specifically researched by the researcher, him or herself. No one else has ever collected those. So if I wanted to know information about the favorite color of everybody in this class, no one has ever collected that research before, I would be using primary research. Secondary research is gathering facts and research that were already collected by other people. For example, if I wanted to know the average GPA of all the people in this class, I would go to the office, find the GPAs for everyone in this class, and then do an average. So I'm using statistics or numbers that was already gathered and created by the office. And so therefore that's called secondary research. Durkheim used secondary research in his quest to use the scientific method to solve society's problems. It's important that we use factual data that is observable, measurable, and testable. In other words, it's something that you can see, it's something that we can quantify, and it's something that we can do over and over again. All right, the 5 steps in the scientific method. These you might already know from a previous science class. They might be worded slightly different, but in essence they're the same thing. The first step is to define the problem. What is your issue, your idea, your problem, your concern for you wanting to do this sort of research? And again, it can be anything. And you're going to be doing some research individually in a participant observation, which you will define the problem. And this time, it's not really going to be a problem more than just an idea or a concern. We're also going to do this as a group and do another method of research that, again, it might be a problem with why are there so many students getting D's and F's in our school? Or why don't people participate in extracurricular activities to the level as they once used to? So you could come up with these different problems. Now, when you come up with your idea for your research, you need to come up with both dependent variable and an independent variable or independent variables. The dependent variable is the subject that you are studying, okay? So if I want to study why so many students are getting D's and F's, that's my dependent variable, grades of students in the 2014-2015 school year. Grades might change depending on my independent factors, which we haven't talked about yet. So realize this behavior may or may not change depending on something I'm looking at or something I might do. Durkheim studied suicide and suicide frequency. So what I have in bold there is what applies to Durkheim's study, so you can maybe understand this. But realize we did dependent variable on our participant observation sheet as well, and that was whatever class you were studying, it was that class's behavior. That's what your dependent variable was. Your independent variable, or independent variables usually, are factors that will will start the change or cause the change of the dependent variable. Okay? So in essence, these things are going to affect the behavior. And for Durkheim, he used social forces. What you have to realize is the independent variable will never change. If you're going to look at gender, males or females, applying to grade point average, you're always going to look at if they're a boy or a girl. The behavior is grade point average. The independent variable is gender. And so you're always going to look at gender, and that's never going to change. But what might change is the level of their GPAs. So social forces that Durkheim used were they married or not? Were they religious or not? Were they involved in the military or not? Socioeconomic status, those sorts of things were his social forces that he was looking at to see if they changed the rate of suicide. So once you have this problem or issue or concern that you're going to do with, and you've broke it down into dependent variable and independent variables, now you need to form a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated guess. So knowing what you know about that particular behavior, what do you think is going to happen? What do you think your research is going to show you? Now you might be way off base or you might be right on, and that's okay. But you need to go with your gut, go with your experience, go with your previous knowledge. Durkheim's hypothesis was suicide would vary by religion, by marital status, by military or civilian status, and by economic status. And for us today, this kind of seems like a no-brainer. We clearly know that those factors change the rate of suicide, but in Durkheim's time, they believed that suicide was a mental illness, and so it had nothing to do with your religion or marital status or if you were in the military or not, or the economic situation that you were living in. So this seems like a no-brainer for us, but at this period of time, it really was a new idea. All right, and the most time-consuming, of course, is the third step, where you're going to be collecting your data, collecting your research. For your participant observation, those are the 5 days that you are going to observe your class. So that took you 5 days. It took you a matter of minutes to come up with your independent variable, dependent variable, and hypothesis, but now you're going to start collecting data. And you're going to use a variety of methods. Like I said, you've already started the participant observation, and later on we're going to do one of the other methods, such as a survey interview or a survey questionnaire, or a natural observation or an experiment. When Durkheim was using secondary research documents, he started looking at his data and started noticing some patterns. As you're collecting the data, excuse me, you might find that you're going to start seeing some patterns. So after day 2 or day 3 of your participant observation, you may start to recognize, oh, look, these people always act like this, or on days like this is the behavior. So he found out that Protestants committed more suicide than Catholics, and Jews had the lowest rate of suicides. So there's the religion. He found out that single people committed suicide at a higher rate than people that were married, and of the married people, it was even lower if they had children. Soldiers committed suicide at a higher rate than regular civilians, and the highest was in bad economic times and lower in economic boom periods. The fourth step is analyzing the data. Okay, once you get this, now Durkheim kind of started analyzing that data as he was collecting it, which you certainly may do, but when you get it all in, now you're going to look at it, you're going to create some statistics. 80% of the time this happened, 4 out of 10 times this happened. So you're going to interpret it and explain it. When Durkheim analyzed his data, he found out that there were 3 different kinds of suicide. One was egoistic, and egoistic is where individuals do not have a strong bond to a social group. My example of that is Romeo and Juliet. They were not supported by the family unit. Their families didn't support their love and their romance with one another, so therefore they committed suicide. Altruistic suicide is the second kind of suicide that Durkheim came up with his analysis. And this is where individuals are completely opposite of egoistic. They are deeply committed to a group and their ideas. So the kamikaze pilots of Japan knew that they were on a suicide mission when they were flying their planes into the buildings and targets, but they were doing it for a cause, for Japan to win. And the third type of suicide that Durkheim came up with was anomic. And this comes down to there's a breakdown in your normal day-to-day routines. You become confused. What your life was like before seems aimless and purposefulless. And what your previous goals were kind of meaningless. Now, my example is cut off at the bottom, but my example is the stock market crash. When there was the stock market crash in the 80s, for example, a lot of people committed suicide simply because they thought, well, I'm not going to have any money when I retire. Everything that I've done, I've saved for is gone. I have no help when it comes to retirement. I don't see an end in sight. I'm going to be working the rest of my life, and therefore I commit suicide. Now, this analysis is way more detailed than I expect you to do for your data. What I want you to do is just give me the most of the time this happened, or only one time this happened. Girls tended to act like this. Boys acted like this. On Mondays, they behaved like this. On Tuesdays, they behaved like this. I just simply want you to give me a more generic analysis of your data. And the fifth step is forming a theory. Now, this is a logical explanation of how some facts are clearly related to other facts. In other words, it's not your thoughts, it's not your educated guess anymore. Based on what you have in front of you, your research, your analysis, your statistics, your data, what is clearly going on here? And Durkheim decided that his theory was that suicide is related to the links or connections that people have with different groups. Your theory, again, may be exactly like your hypothesis, or it may be completely different. And either way, you're still researching. There are really five different methods of research that sociologists use to collect different types of data on behavior. The first one is natural observation, and it's exactly what it sounds like. The researcher or investigator observes the daily activities of a group that they decide they need to study or want to study, but they do nothing to get involved in the daily activities. All they do is observe it. For example, if the principal comes in and observes a teacher, they don't do the worksheet, or they don't take the tests, or they don't do the activities. They're just there to watch and see how the students are acting, how the teacher's acting, how effective all of that is. And so most of us are quite familiar with natural observation. So thinking about that there are 4 or 5 different methods of research for sociologists, there has to be some advantages and disadvantages. So you need to go to the worksheet in your packet that looks like this. We're going to talk about all of these different types of methods, and we're going to compare them based on the concepts of time, cost, the environment, their knowledge, and their accuracy. All right, so natural observation, I'm going to give it a 4 stars just because it does take a lot of time for you to truly get a good idea of what is going on when you observe behavior. You can't just pop in and look at them for a minute and go, yep, that's what happens every minute of every day. So you need to do that more often, and so it does take a lot of time. The cost, the reason why natural observation is done a lot is simply because it is very cheap. You have very few things that you would need as far as cost, maybe some paper to jot down the behaviors that you see or those sorts of things, but really it doesn't cost you much to observe a group. The environment, you observe a group in their natural environment. That's in the title itself or in the name of the method. So the natural environment is where they normally meet. So if I want to study sociology class behavior, I don't pull sociology class into the PE room or the gym or wherever and ask them to go about their normal activities, because that's not in their normal or natural environment. Do they know they're being studied? Yes, usually they do know that they're being studied, and of course we know that that can affect their accuracy. If people know that they are being watched, whether it's little kids, high school kids, adults, teachers, employees, if they know they are being watched, their behavior tends to change. And I don't mean it always changes for the better. I did some recordings of my classroom, and there were students that specifically behaved worse because they thought it was funny to do so. So it doesn't necessarily change it for the better, but it definitely changes it. Now, looking at all of these things, we need to decide, is this a good thing or a bad thing about natural observation? If everything was a positive, nobody would do anything other than natural observations. But time, the fact that natural observation takes a lot of time, that's a negative. So that'd be a disadvantage. Costs being very cheap, that makes it an advantage or a positive thing about this method. Being in the natural environment clearly makes people behave better, more natural, more normal, instead of putting them in a lab and experimenting on them. They're in their natural environment, so that's a good thing. The fact that they know they're being studied, as I mentioned earlier in my example, is a disadvantage, because most people then change their behavior, either for better or for worse. And accuracy, that is a disadvantage. It's not very accurate for a couple of reasons. One, because people know they're being studied, and so they change their behavior for better or for worse. Also, it's not very accurate because you as an observer might have a particular bias. In other words, you're only watching the girls, or you're only tending to look at the left side of the room or the front of the lab instead of the back of the lab. And so this changes your accuracy because you're not really observing everything that goes on in that group you're studying. The second method is participant observation, and this is what you have been working on all by yourself when you're studying a specific group that you already belong to. So when you, the researcher or the investigator, are actually part of the daily activities, you're already a part of that group that you want to study. You're not being an outsider. So you're going to come in as a person that's already there, and now you're going to secretively observe the behavior of this group. One example of this is John Laughlin studied the divine precepts, a cult. And so he originally started as a natural observation. And so he went up to the door, he knocked, and he said, "I would like to observe the behaviors of your group. Would you mind?" And they said, "No, come on in." So he went to weekly meetings and observed their behavior. But after a couple of weeks, he realized, I don't think I'm getting accurate observations because I don't think they're behaving like they normally do because I'm here watching them. So he turned it and he said, all right, now I've been observing this for a couple weeks and I'm done with my research now, but I really like what you're doing here and I would like to join your group, join this cult. And so he joined the cult and took part of the daily activities, and he was one of them. And really what he was doing was making mental notes and jotting things down on the side of what he saw going on. And he got a much better view of what this Divine Precepts cult was really like and what daily life was like. Now again, advantages and disadvantages, same thing. There are going to be some good things and bad things about each of those. So go ahead and turn back to that sheet. And again, we're going to compare them on the same factors. So time, just like natural observation, you definitely have to spend a lot of time observing your group of people. For your particular individual assignment, I asked you to observe your class 5 times. And that's still not going to get you a completely accurate picture of what happens in that class every day. Cost, again, you're just observing. The only thing you might need to do is have the paper to jot those things down on. Maybe you have to pay for a membership if you're going to be, if you're going to observe behavior at the YMCA, you might have to join the YMCA or things like that. But for the most part, if you're already part of the group, it's not really going to be cost up and beyond what you're normally paying. The environment, it's done in its natural environment. You are observing people in their normal habitat. Do they know they're being studied? No, they shouldn't. If you are doing your participant observation accurately, you absolutely should not let them know that you are observing their behavior. So instead of them acting better or worse because they know they're part of your research, they're going to act normal. Accuracy, well, since you're part of this group, you tend to have a slanted or biased opinion of what normal, quote unquote, normal is. And so that makes it accurate, but a little less accurate than maybe some of the other methods, so I gave it a 2-star. Now, as far as advantages and disadvantages, negative or a disadvantage for time because it does take a long time to get accurate results. Cost, that's an advantage because it's really cheap. It's done in their natural environment, so just like natural observation, you get good results, so that's a positive thing. They don't know they're being studied, so that also is a positive thing. And accuracy, it's not really the most accurate method, but it's also probably not the worst either. So therefore, I'm still going to make it a disadvantage. The third method of studying sociological behavior is the experiment. Most of you are quite familiar with experiments because you've taken part of them, maybe in science classes, or maybe actually in the outside world. So it's a study of a group that is performed or carried out in a very controlled environment, and the purpose of that controlled environment is to eliminate any outside forces from affecting the behavior. So we can narrow it down and say people behaved this way because of this. So an experiment really has significant conclusions because of the fact that you're going to control everything. My example of an experiment is the Milgram Experiment. And Stanley Milgram, after World War II, was very curious why Nazi soldiers, Nazi military personnel would obey authority. Even they knew the orders that they were supposed to follow through with were completely wrong and irrational and just inhumane. And so he wanted to study why people obeyed authority. And so what he did was he set up this Milgram Experiment. And he had a laboratory where he had the learner, which is the L down here, and this was actually the person that was part of the experiment, that they had volunteers to come in. The teacher here, who was running the electrodes, for example, you can see was connected to this person, the teacher was actually in on the experiment, so they were not unknowing of what was going on, but the learner was. And then of course the experimenter, like Milgram, who is in the room to make sure all the procedures are done correctly. Now, the pictures that I have here is, here's the box that the people were hooked up to. And this particular thing shows that there are different levels of electricity that the learner would be subject to by the teacher if they didn't learn a series of word pairs. So they would say blue, box, bird, shirt, tongue, and you would have to say blue, bird. Okay, and so that would make much more sense. If you didn't say that, you got a low level of shock. It went from 45 volts up to 450 volts. And 450 volts, it says on the machine, is extremely dangerous. And so as they went up. Now, the learner, the learner was actually the one that was in on it and the teacher was not. Sorry, I had that backwards. So the teacher is the one that's going to administer the shock, and the teacher is the one that's going to read the word pairs to the learner. Now the learner is the one that was in on it, and the learner is just faking it and screaming bloody murder and just saying, oh, I'm in so much pain, I can't continue, and would stop talking, and then the teacher would be like, okay, what's going on? And the experimenter was there to prod them on. If they don't give you the correct answer, you need to administer the shock and continue. What if they don't answer? They said, well, then you need to tell them the correct answer and administer the shock and move on. And so there were several different experiments that went on, and some were with all men, some were with all women, some were with the experimenter out of the room versus in the room. There was also where there were 2 teachers and 1 learner, so they would kind of divvy up the responsibility, so to speak. And this was instrumental in discovering why people behave authority. All right, so looking at the survey questionnaire and the survey interview, as far as time goes, they're clearly the quickest. That's why you do it. You can survey a lot of people in a short amount of time. There are some costs for questionnaires, the paper, maybe you have to mail it out and so forth. The environment, it's both a negative and a positive. It is positive if you ask people to fill out a questionnaire at work about work, or ask, like the school survey would be in the natural environment. If they mail it to you, or you're asked a survey of musical choices and you're in math class, well, that's kind of a foreign environment, so it's not really a positive thing. The fact that they know they're being studied, that's a negative, and we all know that if they're studied, they know they're being studied, they might change answers or, for effect more than anything, and lie or answer the question incorrectly, or they don't understand the question since it's a written questionnaire, makes the surveys not always accurate. And as a matter of fact, a lot of times on surveys you'll see that there is a margin of error, and so they assume that there's going to be some mistakes or some omittance of answers, or just misread things. As far as an interview goes, again, it's quick. It's not as quick as a questionnaire, so it's still a positive, but not maybe as quick as a questionnaire. There are some costs, same thing. You might need paper, you might need a room to interview the people in. Natural and foreign environment, same thing. If I'm interviewing you about math in a math class, that's great. If I'm interviewing you about your sports preferences in math class, that's not really a good thing. You need to kind of be in the same environment. The fact that they know, and especially with an interview, they know that you know who they are. And so on a questionnaire, you're anonymous. On an interview, you're not quite as anonymous. So clearly that's a disadvantage. And they tend to lie on an interview. Face-to-face, especially if the topic is touchy. If they don't want you to know certain things, they feel uncomfortable, they'll tend to lie, again, to make it better or to make it worse. All right, the last few things we need to talk about are population. Now, these apply to all methods, whether you're talking about an experiment, a questionnaire survey, participant observation, any of those 5 methods, you need to know what the population is. And the population is the entire group a person wants to study. Okay, that's the entire group. So if I wanted to study how Iowans are going to vote, my population is everyone that is 18 and older that's registered to vote in Iowa. Now, I certainly wouldn't ask every one of those people their opinions on the voting, but that's the whole group. So I would take a random sampling. And again, this is a method that randomly selects some people out of that population, and every member has an equal chance of being selected for the question, okay, or for the survey, or for the experiment. You can do that by a lottery, putting everybody's name in a hat and randomly drawing them. Now, they don't do things quite that primitive now. Now it's a computer that lottery picks the names. It's no different than lottery pick for being called as a juror. You could say every 10th name, every 15th name, every 77th name. So you have a list and you just count down to 50. That's a person. Count to 50 again. That's a person. You can also stratify this sampling by putting them in specific categories or groups. If your method is important to know how do men answer versus how do women answer, how do 50-year-olds answer versus 20-year-olds, then you would want to stratify your entire population. So you would take your population, divide them or subdivide them into those categories, and then randomly select from a lottery 20 women's names or 20 men's names or 20 people that are 50 years old or 20 people that are 30 years old. And so if that's important, you would do that. If you don't care how boys or girls answer, you wouldn't stratify it. You would just randomly get 50 people, and if that meant it was 40 men and 10 women, who cares? But if you need to know what that is, then you would stratify that random sampling.